From New York, this is Democracy Now!
I felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic. All you had to do is look at other countries. I think now it's in almost 120 countries all over the world. No, I've always viewed it as very serious.
You know, tackling this pandemic is a national emergency, akin to fighting a war.
We must make certain that this health and economic crisis is not another money-making opportunity for corporate America and for Wall Street.
Joe Biden sweeps Tuesday's 3 Democratic presidential primaries that were marred by chaos and fears over the spread of coronavirus at polling places as many Americans stayed home. Nearly 1 in 5 households have already experienced a layoff or reduction in work due to the pandemic. Trump wants to inject more than $1 trillion into the economy and send a $1,000 check to everyone. Who will benefit? We'll get response from California Congressmember Ro Khanna. He's also co-chair of Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, and Vanita Gupta, Obama Justice Department official, who's calling for states to proceed with elections while protecting public health. Then mass shutdowns and layoffs are putting millions of U.S. restaurant workers who live paycheck to paycheck at risk. We'll speak with a restaurant organizer and laid-off worker. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Confirmed cases of the coronavirus have topped 200,000 worldwide, with over 8,000 deaths reported. One of the hardest-hit nations is Iran, where researchers warn the rate of infections won't peak until May, and that as many as 3.5 million people could die. Officially, Iran has reported just under 1,000 deaths, but the World Health Organization believes the actual death toll could be 5 times higher. Italy reported 345 new cases in the last 24 hours, with the death toll topping 2,500. In Spain, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez addressed a mostly empty parliament Wednesday, with only a few dozen lawmakers allowed to attend in person. Spain has had 533 deaths among nearly 12,000 confirmed cases and is in nationwide lockdown. In Madrid, migrants climbed onto the roof of an immigration jail Tuesday, protesting poor medical treatment as prisoners become ill. In Latin America, the Guatemalan government has temporarily suspended the arrival of U.S. deportation flights transporting Central American asylum seekers as part of an asylum agreement with the U.S. In Africa, at least 30 nations, covering more than half the continent, have confirmed COVID-19 cases. Tunisia's president ordered a 12-hour nightly curfew and asked workers to donate half their salaries to fighting the pandemic. Ivory Coast has closed schools and joined other West African nations in barring flights from affected countries. In the United States, the pandemic has reached all 50 states after West Virginia reported its first COVID-19 patient. There have been over 6,200 recorded cases and 107 deaths in the U.S., but public health experts warn the true rate of infection is likely exponentially higher due to the severe shortage of tests. Many people who spread the virus are asymptomatic, helping the pathogen to pass undetected from host to host. Researchers at the Imperial College of London warn in a new study that without dramatic action, the novel coronavirus could kill as many as 2.2 million people living in the United States. Despite the dire warnings, large crowds continue to gather in many parts of the U.S. In Florida, beaches were full of spring break revelers Tuesday and were set to reopen today, though Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has ordered bars and nightclubs closed. Officials in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Nashville, Tennessee ordered concert venues closed after viral videos showed densely packed crowds holding early St. Patrick's Day celebrations over the weekend. In New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio said Tuesday that all 8.6 million city residents may soon be asked to shelter in place, with a decision expected within 48 hours. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo quickly contradicted the mayor's warning.
No city in the state can quarantine itself without state approval. And I have no interest whatsoever and no plan whatsoever to quarantine any city.
Governor Cuomo has slammed the Trump administration for inaction. He said New York has only about 4,000 ventilators, critical tools in keeping patients with severe respiratory problems alive. A government task force warned New York could be short by some 16,000 ventilators at the peak of the crisis. Cuomo said peak will occur in about 45 days.
They are expecting as many as 55,000 to 110,000 hospital beds will be needed at that point.
New York currently has just 53,000 hospital beds. New York City's Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the largest public transit system in the U.S., asked the federal government for a $4 billion bailout as ridership plummeted. A resident of a New York City homeless shelter tested positive for coronavirus, and an employee at Sing Sing Prison north of New York City tested positive. In Colorado, 10 prisoners at the for-profit Aurora Immigration Detention Center were put into quarantine over COVID-19 fears and are awaiting test results. This comes as the Los Angeles Times reports ICE agents equipped with protective masks continued to arrest immigrants in their homes in California Monday, even as much of the state locked down. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's planning a broad crackdown on asylum seekers crossing the southern border. Under the emerging plan, Border Patrol agents would immediately return anyone to Mexico who crosses outside of official ports of entry without due process. Mexico has 82 confirmed cases of COVID-19 compared to over 6,200 in the United States, and that number is expected to be seriously higher. In Washington, the Trump administration said Tuesday it will support a plan to inject more than $1 trillion into the U.S. economy to fight the unprecedented economic crash caused by the pandemic. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has proposed a stimulus package that would rapidly deliver a $1,000 check to most American adults, with more direct payments likely in the months ahead. Mnuchin called the pandemic worse than 9/11 for the airline industry and called for a $50 billion bailout. Sarah Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants, had this response.
We have told Congress that any stimulus funds for the aviation industry must come with strict rules. That includes requiring employers across aviation to maintain pay and benefits for every worker. No taxpayer money for CEO bonuses, stock buybacks, or dividends. No breaking contracts through bankruptcy. And no federal funds for airlines that are fighting their workers' efforts to join a union.
Neiman Marcus and The Gap Tuesday became the latest U.S. retailers to announce nationwide store closures. General Motors, Ford Motor, Fiat Chrysler said Tuesday they would keep their factories open for now, operating with limited capacity with new sanitation protocols. The United Auto Workers Union has called for all U.S. auto factories to be closed for 2 weeks as a safeguard. Bloomberg reports Secretary Mnuchin told Republican senators that without interventions, the U.S. jobless rate could hit 20%. An NPR PBS NewsHour poll found nearly 1 in 5 U.S. households has already experienced a layoff or a reduction in work hours. The World Health Organization is considering ordering medical workers to take airborne precautions while treating COVID-19 patients after a new study showed the virus may be transmissible for up to 3 hours in aerosolized droplets. The report in the New England Journal of Medicine also warns the virus can survive up to 24 hours on cardboard surfaces and up to 2 to 3 days on plastic and stainless steel. President Donald Trump said Tuesday he'd always known that the coronavirus outbreak was a pandemic, contradicting dozens of public statements he's made since January downplaying the threat of the virus.
I've always known this is a pandemic. I felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic.
In previous weeks, Trump said his administration had shut down the virus, suggested people sick with the virus could go to work, said the virus would miraculously go away in April, said the numbers were, quote, going to get progressively better, and tweeted the risk is low to the average American. Trump has falsely claimed anybody that wants a test can get a test. As homebound Americans are increasingly going online to keep in touch with friends and family, some Internet providers, including AT&T and Comcast, have lifted data caps without significant interruptions to service from the increased bandwidth. The crisis has renewed calls for the FCC to regulate the Internet as a utility and for a reversal of the Trump administration's repeal of net neutrality protections. Meanwhile, Facebook began censoring coronavirus news articles from a number of outlets Tuesday, including The Atlantic, BuzzFeed, Politico, and Democracy Now! A Facebook executive blamed a bug in an anti-spam artificial intelligence system. Former Vice President Joe Biden consolidated his lead in the race for the Democratic presidential nomination Tuesday in a primary election marred by chaos, confusion, and fears over the spread of coronavirus at polling places. Biden won Florida and Illinois by a wide margin and scored a victory in Arizona. He addressed his supporters via video stream Tuesday night from his home in Wilmington, Delaware, in a speech focused on the coronavirus.
You know, tackling this pandemic is a national emergency, akin to fighting a war. And it's going to require leadership and cooperation from every level of government. And it's going to require us to move thoughtfully and decisively to quickly address both the public health crisis as well as the economic crisis.
In Illinois, which recorded its first coronavirus death Tuesday, more than 800 election judges, many of them elderly and highly at risk, refused to participate in Tuesday's election. At least 200 Chicago polling places were moved away from highly sensitive sites, including nursing homes and senior centers. At the Thurgood Marshall Public Library, scores of mostly African-American voters waited for up to 2 hours in a cramped lobby for their turn to cast a ballot. Ohio was also scheduled to vote Tuesday, but Governor Mike DeWine delayed his state's primary until June 2nd after declaring a public health emergency. Democratic National Committee Chair Tom Perez came under intense criticism for supporting in-person voting during the pandemic. Bernie Sanders' campaign advisor David Sirota tweeted, "There is something very wrong with a political culture that tells people to run out of their homes in the middle of a lethal pandemic to cast votes to protect health insurance industry profits and kill proposals to guarantee basic medical care to all," he said. In a speech Tuesday evening, Senator Bernie Sanders made no mention of his primary losses, instead outlined a $2 trillion coronavirus emergency plan. His proposal would send $2,000 monthly cash payments to every U.S. household during the crisis, full unemployment benefits for laid-off workers, an end to evictions and utility shutoffs, a moratorium on mortgage and student loan payments, and expanded health coverage through Medicare.
If you're uninsured, if you are underinsured, if you have high deductibles, if you have high copayments, if you have out-of-pocket expenses, Medicare will cover those expenses.
In Illinois' 3rd congressional district, progressive challenger Marie Newman declared victory in Tuesday's primary election against conservative incumbent Democrat Dan Lipinski. Newman won the support of Senator Bernie Sanders and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez after she backed the Green New Deal and Medicare for All. She's also endorsed by NARAL Pro-Choice America. Lipinski is known for his anti-choice beliefs, and in January, he asked the Supreme Court to overturn abortion rights under Roe v. Wade. He also voted against the Affordable Care Act in 2010. And the Chinese government has announced it'll expel American journalists working for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. The Chinese government also demanded outlets like Time magazine provide detailed information of their reporting in China. This comes as the Trump administration last month limited the number of Chinese citizens allowed to work in U.S.-based Chinese outlets to 100 and announced that 5 state-run Chinese news organizations would be regulated as Chinese government functionaries. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The number of reported cases of coronavirus in the United States has surged to more than 6,200, though the devastating lack of tests mean the number infected is exponentially higher. Deaths have topped 107. Millions are staying home to avoid spreading the disease. Nearly 1 in 5 households in the United States have already experienced a layoff or work reduction due to the pandemic, according to a new PBS-NPR Marist poll. On Tuesday, the Trump administration said it'll support a plan to inject more than $1 trillion into the U.S. economy to fight the unprecedented drop in economic activity. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said the stimulus package would rapidly deliver a $1,000 check to most American adults, with more direct payments likely in the months ahead.
Americans need cash now, and the president wants to get cash now. And I mean now, in the next 2 weeks.
Pandemic worse than 9/11 for the airline industry, and called for a $50 billion bailout. This comes as the Democrat-led House passed a multi-billion-dollar package Monday that significantly weakened paid sick leave measures it tried to enact days earlier. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act passed the House Monday evening after changes were made that were called technical corrections. The Wall Street Journal reported Tuesday that, quote, Democratic aides were alarmed by the changes, which were passed with no objections because House lawmakers are away from Washington on recess. The changes weren't shown to most lawmakers before the vote, unquote. Well, for more, we go to Congressmember Ro Khanna, Democrat from California, member of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. In response to the pandemic, he's also co-sponsored a bill for an emergency earned income tax credit that would give up to $6,000 to everyone who made less than $130,000 last year. His Bay Area district has been hit hard by the coronavirus, and about 7 million residents there have been told to stay home for all but the most crucial outings until April 7th. They are sheltering in place. Congressmember Khanna, welcome back to Democracy Now! In a moment, we want to talk to you about the primary results and Joe Biden's sweep and should the primaries go on. But right now, let's go right to what's happening in the House. The discussions of unemployment insurance increasing, of paid leave being guaranteed. Is this happening?
It is. We need to do all of the above. I mean, we need a massive stimulus. The first thing we need is a cash infusion to ordinary Americans, many of whom have seen paychecks reduced, many of whom who've already filed unemployment insurance claims. We need to extend unemployment insurance. We need to beef up the paid leave. The House took the first step. But as you know, large corporations were excluded. They shouldn't be. And we need a guarantee of paid leave, not just for the coronavirus, but if people are sick. We don't want them coming into work. So there's a lot of work that remains to be done.
But what is happening? What kind of pressures are being brought on the House? Let's talk about that paid leave. Yes, in the end, apparently with Nancy Pelosi negotiating with Mnuchin, the exemptions were made for companies that had more than 500 workers or less than 50. What we're talking about, at first the bill passed, would affect maybe 20% of workers getting paid sick leave. But now it sounds like it's going to be much less than that.
Well, it's inadequate. There's no doubt about it. That said, Amy, I mean, every House Democrat believes in paid leave and believes that it should apply to companies larger than 500. The problem is that we're negotiating with Trump and McConnell to get anything done. I do believe, though, that we have a lot of leverage. I mean, this president needs a deal. The economy is on the verge of a real crisis, and we should make sure that we are pushing for things that are actually going to help. And we know from all the economists that that means paid leave. It means getting money into the pockets of those who are unemployed and the working class. So we need to re-explore this. And in this third package, we do make sure that we don't have the exemptions for companies over 500 and make sure we're reimbursing not just for coronavirus, but for a period of up to 2 weeks if there are small businesses that need that reimbursement.
So talk about what the White House is now proposing. At first, President Trump, until in the last few days, he's been saying who even knew anything like this could happen like a month ago, referring to the pandemic. Now he's saying he's always known there was a pandemic. And the White House and Steve Mnuchin are proposing this $1 trillion bailout, originally asking for much less. But who will profit in fact, in this? What guarantee, as he has had a stream of corporate executives at the White House over the last few weeks, that it's the workers that will benefit, that there will be strings attached to the massive amount of money that could transfer to U.S. corporations and wealthy individuals?
Well, what we need to do is have, if we are going to have $1 trillion, have that directed to increasing unemployment insurance, have that directed towards direct cash grants to every American who's making under $150,000 or $130,000, so that people actually who need the money are getting it. What we shouldn't have is large bailouts for industry. Frankly, what the president ought to be doing is invoking the Defense Production Act so that we can have some of these industries producing ventilators. We have a huge shortage of ventilators here. In Britain, they've converted Rolls-Royce factories to producing ventilators. What we ought to be doing is moving our economy to a footing where we can produce medical supplies. So the last thing we need is bailouts for large industries that look like just a handout to shareholders. We need to give the money to working class Americans, to Americans that are hurting, to the poor and low wealth. The Reverend Barber talks about 140 million Americans who are double the poverty line or less. That's who needs to get the money. And then we have to reorient our economy towards producing things that are going to help us deal with this coronavirus crisis.
After yesterday's primaries, Democratic presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders spoke Tuesday night from his campaign headquarters in Burlington, Vermont, laying out a plan for how the U.S. should respond to the coronavirus pandemic. This is a part of what he said.
We need to make certain that everybody in our country who needs to go to a doctor can get the health care they need regardless of their income. This is kind of a no-brainer, something that should have happened in our country many, many years ago. But in the midst of this crisis, what I believe we must do is empower Medicare to cover all medical bills during this emergency. Now, this is not Medicare for all. We can't pass that right now. But what this does say is that if you're uninsured, if you are underinsured, if you have high deductibles, if you have high copayments, if you have out-of-pocket expenses, Medicare will cover those expenses so that everybody, regardless of their health care needs, and I'm not just talking about the coronavirus, but their health care needs in the midst of this crisis, will get all the health care that they need.
Ro Khanna, you're co-chair of Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. Elaborate on how this is being presented in the U.S. Congress, with most Americans, even before the pandemic was spreading to the extent it was, for example, being for Medicare for all. But what would this mean right now, and how can this be enforced in the House and then get a pass through the Republican-led Senate?
Well, as Senator Sanders said, it's common sense. We don't want someone to face a bill of a few $1,000s if they're sick and going to the doctor at this point. And what the senator is saying is it's not just making sure people are getting tested for coronavirus. If someone has the flu, if someone has other symptoms, if someone is ill, you don't want them to be going to work. You don't want them to avoid going to a doctor or going to a hospital or engaging someone even on the phone or through telehealth because of a bill. And so for at least a period of 3 months or 6 months, we ought to say that the basic health care of every American is going to be covered. This is going to make us safer because we're only as safe as the least insured among us. And we are hopeful that this is something that everyone can get around. I mean, it's not, as Senator Sanders said, Medicare for all. It's an emergency 3 to 6 month plan to give people health care. We've seen in a country like South Korea that has been far better at testing based on a single-payer approach.
Testing. Let's talk about testing. Let's talk about the devastating lack of tests that are available to people, despite what the president keeps saying, that every American can get a test. We know that the lack of tests are fueling this pandemic in the United States, that public health officials can't see where there are outbreaks, that people can't know whether they have tested positive, though have symptoms and are desperately trying to. I mean, it now has been documented that the U.S. could have used the World Health Organization tests like South Korea and other countries. They didn't. They put out a flawed test of their own. And now, can you tell us, is there an accounting of where these tests are? Can they be made available? What can you do as a Congress member?
Well, Amy, it is the biggest national scandal that we did not use the World Health Organization tests. I asked in committee both the director of the CDC and a senior official at the NIH, why did we not use the World Health Organization tests? And they were unable to give us an answer. They had really no explanation other than, I think, an over-reliance on everything had to be American-made, which is fine if we had the capacity. But we didn't, because we had systematic underinvestment in public health. Our CDC budget should have been much higher. But the point is that at some point there has to be a reckoning why we didn't use those World Health Organization tests. It was probably the biggest mistake made. Now, all of us in Congress are pushing for tests to be widely available. There has been progress on these tests that should be deployed. The challenge is we're probably still a week or 2 weeks out. And then we need telehealth. And some of us have been calling and have a plan with COVID Alliance to get a national telehealth center, because we don't want every American rushing to go get a test. You have to first see if you're symptomatic and have the profile that would require a test. And a lot of that can be done through telehealth by consultation with doctors and nurses, so that we don't overburden our healthcare facilities. Unfortunately, that hasn't yet been set up.
And what about the Federal Reserve of Emergency Reserve, the devastating effect of this on healthcare workers and the kinds of just personal protective equipment that people can have access to?
It's mind-boggling, Amy, why we don't invoke the Defense Production Act to do two things. First, we ought to be producing as many N95 masks as possible. I've heard so many stories from my district of doctors and nurses. They only are having one mask that they're wearing throughout the day for different multiple procedures, and that's just frankly unsafe. We need to protect the people who are on the front lines of this crisis. And second, as so many experts have said, we are at real danger of running out of ventilators. And if that happens in this country, we're going to have awful choices about who we save and who doesn't get saved. And I don't understand why there's not outrage and a cry in this country to turn every possible production facility into producing ventilators so that we have as much supply as possible. That really ought to be an urgent challenge. There's 57 members of Congress who've written to the president to do that. But this shouldn't be about politics. We just need great production of ventilators and production of masks in this country.
Very quickly before we go to break, then we'll also be joined by Vinita Gupta talking about the primaries yesterday. One of the hardest hit nations is Iran, where researchers warn a rate of infections won't peak till May, that there could be as many as 3.5 million people who will die. Amidst everyone's focus, of course, on their personal health and the community health, there's very little reporting on what the U.S. did yesterday, which was imposing fresh sanctions on Iran, keeping up its economic pressure campaign, even as the people of Iran are dealing with this coronavirus pandemic, calling on the Islamic Republic to release detained Americans. Can you respond to this?
Well, we have to have some sense of humanitarian concern. It's wrong for us not to be assisting Iran to deal with its own crisis. And there is a sense of the worth of human life that transcends any border or any politics. And I have called repeatedly for making sure that our sanctions are not in any way impeding humanitarian aid, medical aid, getting to the Iranian people so that they can deal with this crisis. And second, as we've seen, there is no such thing as a disease that is contained within one nation. The more the disease spreads in a place like Iran, the more it hurts the entire world. It's not going to stay just in Iran. So this is something that is, yet again, a misguided administration policy in Iran.
Ro Khanna, please stay with us. Democratic Congressmember from California. His community, the Greater Bay Area, is now under orders to shelter at home. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in 30 seconds. That's cellist Yo-Yo Ma. As the coronavirus pandemic spread, he took to social media Monday to share a song of comfort, a song from Bach's Cello Suite No. 3. He dedicated the song to the healthcare workers on the front lines, writing, quote, "Your ability to balance human connection and scientific truth in service of us all gives me hope." This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to the results of Tuesday's primaries for the Democratic presidential nomination, which were marred by chaos, confusion, and fears over the spread of coronavirus at polling places. Former Vice President Joe Biden consolidated his lead as he won Florida and Illinois by a wide margin and scored a victory in Arizona. In Illinois, which recorded its first coronavirus death on Tuesday, more than 800 election judges, many of them elderly and highly at risk, refused to participate in Tuesday's primary. At least 200 Chicago polling places were moved away from highly sensitive sites, including nursing homes and senior centers. At the Thurgood Marshall Public Library, scores of mostly African-American voters waited for up to 2 hours in a cramped lobby for their turn to cast a ballot. Ohio was also scheduled to vote Tuesday, but Republican Governor Mike DeWine delayed his state's primary until June 2nd after declaring a public health emergency. He defied a federal judge. Democratic National Committee Chair Tom Perez came under intense criticism for supporting in-person voting during the outbreak. Well, for more, we're joined by Vanita Gupta, former head of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division in the Obama administration, now president and chief executive of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's oldest and largest civil rights coalition. They issued a call with 100 voting rights groups for states to proceed with elections while protecting public health. And we continue with Ro Khanna, the Democratic Congressmember from California, co-chair of Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. Welcoming you both to Democracy Now! Vanita Gupta, can you lay out why you feel these elections should continue, these primaries, in the midst of this pandemic, when people are trying to figure out how to stay home, being told that you should go home, not go to work, to protect yourselves and the community? They're also being told to go out to vote. Why do you think this is a good idea at this point?
So the Leadership Conference actually has not this week kind of taken any position on whether in-person voting should go forward or not. I think the important thing is that every state and locality needs to make that decision for themselves based on conditions that exist in the state, and we understand that. What we are saying very emphatically is that states need to enact a series of election reforms and policies immediately in order to ensure that upcoming primaries and certainly the November election, that states are actually prepared. We don't know what the conditions are going to be, what the kind of look of the pandemic is going to be over the summer. A lot of states have actually postponed their upcoming primaries into June. And the problem is there's a lot of uncertainty. And so what we are saying is that states need to be better prepared to have things like vote by mail, absentee ballots, no excuse absentee ballots with the kind of security that we need. We are asking that if their states do choose to have in-person voting, that they actually follow CDC election guidance that requires social distancing in lines, it requires disinfecting and hand sanitization, understanding the incredible challenges that the country is facing right now. The problem is we cannot undermine our democracy in the next several months, even as we are facing unprecedented public health challenges. And so we need states to enact these measures in order to allow democracy to go forward while maintaining public health for all of us.
Ro Khanna, what is your position?
I was not.
Ro Khanna, your position as your co-chair of Bernie Sanders' campaign, presidential campaign, on whether these primaries should go forward as scheduled.
Well, Amy, I was not able to hear Vanita Gupta. Let me just say I have tremendous respect and admiration for her. I actually think she should be one day a candidate for the Supreme Court. That said, here we may respectfully disagree. I believe the right to vote is sacred. But I also think that there was such concern about people's safety, such concern about exposing people to groups of exposure, and concern about whether people really would feel comfortable exercising their vote. I don't see what the harm really would be to having had those elections delayed the way that the governor of Ohio, frankly, did. So that would have been my recommendation if I were advising any of the governors of these states.
And what would it mean, Ro Khanna, if the primaries are delayed for an indefinite period of time? I mean, the governor of New York, Governor Cuomo, said we're talking about 45 days before this even peaks. So we're going through the primary season. What would you suggest?
Well, I think we have to consider the health and safety of people first. And there's no way that we should be exposing people to the risk of congregating in groups if that's going to mean more exposure to the coronavirus. And if that means even one or two people are at the risk of death or serious illness. I mean, that's just not something we do as a nation that values the dignity of life of every human being. So I would suggest that you could have vote by mail. I would suggest alternative means of participating and some delay as much as is possible. These are difficult decisions, but I just think that the safety and life of our population has to be first.
Amy, if I could,
yes,
because Congressman Khanna did not hear me, unfortunately. He and I actually quite agree with this, and that the safety and health of our communities has to come first. What the Leadership Conference and over 200 national civil and human rights groups have been saying that are deep in the space on voting rights is that we have to make sure that safety comes first, but that states are adequately prepared with the kind of measures of vote by mail, absentee ballot, making sure that we've got polling place adjustments for states that decide to go forward after assessing their own conditions. We need extended periods of early voting so that people can actually have much more time to vote by mail than currently exists. There's a series of measures that states need to enact given this highly, unusual, atypical set of circumstances around this pandemic so that we can both protect voters' public health while maintaining a democracy that is able to move forward. It is long past time for states, red or blue, to enact these kinds of common sense measures that would allow people to vote from the comfort of their homes securely and safely, because we need to be ready by November. There can be no postponement of the November general election. The good news right now is that states have many, many months to prepare and to get these measures in place. If they are not able to in advance of the primaries, that is one thing, although I think these postponements give states the time to do this. But certainly there can be no excuse for delaying a November election, given that states have the time, and Congress needs to fund it. In any COVID-19 package that goes forward moving now, we need to make sure that election reform and funding exists to fund these kinds of changes so that we are absolutely ready come November.
Let me ask you, Vanita Gupta, about the group of 1,600 individuals, including more than 100 medical professionals, who wrote an open letter calling for the next round of presidential primaries to be postponed until May because of the coronavirus epidemic, pandemic. They write, We have seen long lines of voters in states like Texas and Michigan. The amount of time standing in line with hundreds or even thousands of other voters substantially increases the likelihood someone will get sick. So we are not talking far into the future. They are talking about postponing the next round of presidential primaries, saying the very thing you're proposing. They're asking, can that be put in place?
Yeah, I mean, look, we have to respect, we've got to, as we said, put the health and safety of voters first. We need to, that's why states are making these decisions. Increasingly, more and more states are postponing their primaries. What we are saying at the Leadership Conference is that use the time of this postponement to get measures in place that would allow for secure, safe vote by mail, no excuse absentee ballot measures and the like. A lot of states still don't have those measures in place. They need to have a whole bunch of guardrails that would be associated with vote by mail as well. Put those in place now to be ready. That's what we are saying. The danger is, and you know this, that election reforms and voting rights work is often kind of put to the side, and it doesn't have bipartisan support. This is a moment where the nation needs to come together, where Republican and Democratic secretaries of states, governors, senators and members of the House of Representatives in Congress need to come together and enact these reforms that we have listed in great detail and make sure that they are funded so that states can get to work and get these measures put in place to address the very kinds of concerns that are like really important listed in this letter from public health experts.
I want to ask you, Vinita Gupta, about the recent reports that the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, is urging conservative judges to retire now while Republicans still control the White House and Senate so that they can confirm their replacements. The New York Times writes, quote, Senator Mitch McConnell, who has used his position as majority leader to build a judicial confirmation juggernaut for President Trump over the past 3 years, has been personally reaching out to judges to sound them out on their plans and assure them that they would have a worthy successor if they gave up their seats soon, according to multiple people with knowledge of his actions, telling them as having senior status, they will continue to be paid so that while the Republicans control the Senate, they can replace those judges. We just have 30 seconds. If you can talk about the significance of this move and in the midst of this pandemic, what people should be paying attention to.
Look, we cannot lose sight of what's happening to our federal courts. The federal courts impact every part of our life. And Senator McConnell has been single-minded about packing the courts with extreme judges, nominees who are rated not qualified by the ABA, totally undiverse. 2/3 of the appellate judges that have been confirmed in the Trump administration are white men, many of them carrying very extreme views against gay marriage, trying to undermine voting protections and voting rights in this country. They're very young. These people will serve in these positions for a lifetime. And so even as we are grappling with the enormous kind of democracy burdens that the pandemic is causing us, let's not lose sight of what's happening to our federal courts, which will have impact not only on our lives, but our children's and our grandchildren's lives. And this is why when it comes to November, we need a pro-civil rights Senate. We need a pro-civil rights administration that is going to do the right thing and ensure the enforcement of long, hard-fought civil rights protections for all of our communities. But I don't think any of us were surprised that Senator McConnell has been quietly but now openly doing this to further pack our courts. And he will continue to do it until we stand up as a country and say that those hard-fought protections are worthy and most important of being protected moving forward by our federal courts.
Vinita Gupta, I want to thank you for being with us, President of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She was head of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice in the Obama administration. And also great thanks to Congressmember Ro Khanna of California. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, millions of restaurant workers around the country are losing their jobs. What will happen to them? Stay with us. Sweet Eastern Trip by Astor Piazzolla. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to look at how the mass shutdowns and layoffs due to the spread of COVID-19 are affecting millions of restaurant workers across the United States. With cities across the U.S. going dark, bars and restaurants closed for the foreseeable future, servers, bartenders, kitchen staff, and more have been left in the lurch, many without paid sick leave, paid time off, or benefits. One study estimates 4 million restaurant workers in the U.S. are at risk of losing their jobs in a matter of weeks. Many were already living paycheck to paycheck. This is India John, a server at the Chocolate Bar in Cleveland, Ohio, which is closed due to the coronavirus.
I'm kind of upset about the closing because of rent and financials, and I know that we all have families to take care of and things like that. I do want us to all be safe and healthy, but I'm really concerned about how I'm going to pay my bills.
Nearly 1 in 5 households have already experienced a layoff or work reduction due to the pandemic, according to a new PBS-NPR Marist poll. As many hope for desperately needed federal assistance, the Senate is set to take up a significantly weakened emergency coronavirus bill the House passed Monday night. The bill had already exempted employers with more than 500 workers, such as megacorporations like McDonald's and Amazon, only protecting 20% of workers in the private sector. Now it's expected to leave out even more workers, including millions who work for small businesses. The Reverend Dr. William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign tweeted, "Congress must go back and pass another bill that covers all workers. They cannot leave out millions by exempting some low-wage workers from paid sick leave. These workers will not be exempted from the disease." This comes as the Trump administration said Tuesday it'll support a plan to inject more than $1 trillion into the U.S. economy to fight the unprecedented drop in economic activity. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said the stimulus package would rapidly deliver a $1,000 check to most American adults, with more direct payments likely to come in the months ahead. For more, we're joined by 2 guests. From California, by Democracy Now! Video stream in Berkeley, Saru Jayaraman is with us, the co-founder of the Restaurant Opportunity Center United, president of One Fair Wage and director of the Food Labor Research Center at University of California, Berkeley. We are also joined in New York by a laid-off worker, by Damani Varnado, restaurant worker in catering, fine dining, cocktailing for the past 20 years. He was working at Tiny's in the bar upstairs when the whole staff was let go during the coronavirus epidemic. Sarah, let's start with you. Give us the scope of the problem and what's happening now. I mean, we're talking to you in Berkeley. San Francisco, 7 million people are just sheltering in sight right now.
Yeah, and I think that we're just the tip of the iceberg. I think we're going to see this happen nationwide. You mentioned that as many as 4 or 5 million workers are at risk of being laid off in the restaurant industry. I think it's much higher than that. The restaurant industry is nearing 14 million workers nationally. And I think that you're going to see a very large percentage of those workers at risk of being laid off as more of the country follows the Bay Area with shelter in place. And that is devastating because this industry had severe structural inequality problems that existed long before this crisis. In particular, this industry, unlike almost every other industry, was allowed to pay a sub-minimum wage to its tipped workers, forcing them to live off of tips. That's an actual literal legacy of slavery and a source of terrible sexual harassment for a mostly female workforce of servers and bartenders and bussers. Now, think about that workforce when it's laid off. First of all, there have been very little tips in the last few weeks leading up to shutdowns. And so already people were struggling. With layoff, people have been living, I call it literally tip to mouth. They got tips on Friday. They were laid off over the weekend. They can't feed their kids on Monday. We started a relief fund for these workers Monday morning at 9:30. We've had almost 15,000 workers apply for relief in just over a 24-hour period. And that's because most of these workers aren't going to qualify for any kind of unemployment benefits or paid sick leave, as you mentioned. Paid sick leave wouldn't last long enough anyway. But even if they do qualify, even if they are eligible, a sub-minimum wage and a very poor or rough calculation of tips. I mean, unemployment insurance is already a percentage of your income. For sub-minimum wage restaurant workers, you're talking about a percentage of your income. There was a problem that existed before this crisis that is now exemplifying why we needed $15, one fair wage, much more sustainable industry long before the crisis hit.
So what exactly are you pushing for, Sadhu Jayaraman?
We're pushing for multiple things in this moment and long term. Right now, we are pushing for that unemployment benefits actually provide some buffer, particularly for tipped workers, that they overcompensate for the fact that really the government has no clear idea of how much these workers actually earned in tips. So we want to see a better calculation of unemployment benefits, number one. Absolutely paid sick leave covering all industries, all workers, and better paid family leave as well. In terms of relief for businesses, we would like to see targeted relief along the lines of what Senator Warren called for, basically targeted relief for businesses that are willing to move to a sustainable model post-crisis. Let's encourage businesses post-crisis. Let's support businesses to stay with us through the crisis and to move to a better model post-crisis so that we're not in the same boat afterwards. So that would look like tax and rent abatements for small businesses that are willing to commit to going to $15 and one fair wage after the crisis. We don't want to see this industry stuck through the crisis only at the end of it with large chains surviving because they're the ones that are able to weather the crisis. We don't want to see small businesses go out of business as a result of the crisis, but we do want to see businesses encouraged through this crisis, supported through this crisis, that are willing to make a commitment to change, because clearly the crisis is highlighting why we needed that change in the first place.
So I want to turn to a comment of Robert Reich, who said earlier this week, he tweeted, McDonald's, Burger King, Pizza Hut, Dunkin' Donuts, Wendy's, Taco Bell, Subway, none give their workers paid sick leave. They should be required to post this sign on their doors because we don't give our workers paid sick leave. They may be sick when they serve you. That was Robert Reich, the former labor secretary. Sadhu, you retweeted his message. Talk about this for people to understand as the White House talks out bailing out the economy. Who is being bailed out and who isn't? And are there strings being put on these bailouts to ensure that their workers are protected? When they say they're bailing out the airline industry to the tune of $50 billion, are the airline flight attendants, are the workers on the planes, et cetera, are they being protected? But you stick with what you know, the restaurant workers and these large corporations.
No, absolutely. That's exactly my point. There is talk of very large bailout, and in some cases, funding already going to very large restaurant corporations that many of whom have been taken over by hedge funds. So this is Wall Street controlling very large restaurant corporations. They are seeing potential large subsidies, tax subsidies, incentives. There is talk also of support even for smaller businesses, but we haven't seen it yet. Meanwhile, these same large businesses are not being forced to provide their workers with paid leave and not being called on when receiving these bailouts to move to higher wages that we know would have staved off the kind of dire situation we're seeing right now among millions of workers had they been forced to pay livable wages and provide paid sick leave prior. And so what we need is not mass bailouts of an industry with absolutely no strings attached or requirements for workers. What we need is relief for an industry that encourages or requires actually moving to livable wages, moving to what we call one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top, as we have here in California, and paid sick leave because 90% of workers across the country don't have the ability to take a day off when they are sick. 2/3 reported that they worked when sick before coronavirus. Yes, a lot of workers are going to be laid off, and so paid leave is not going to be as relevant for them. But Think about all the delivery workers that are continuing to work. Do we want them to work when they are sick? No. We need to see paid leave applied to everybody. We need companies to be forced to pay livable wages if they're going to get any kind of relief from the government.
I want to bring Damani Varnado into this conversation, longtime New York City restaurant worker. He right now is in another studio in New York City, so we can maintain our social distance and keep our workplaces safe. But it's so good to have you with us, Damani. Can you talk about what happened to you? We only have a few minutes. You were just laid off from a place in Tribeca.
Yeah, I can tell you the short about it is we were down in Tribeca. Tribeca is a pool of money. There's a lot of influence down there from Wall Street to families to smaller businesses to basically tourists coming in. I'd say that the pandemic started about a month ago, and we noticed when Europe was starting to close restaurants and businesses and people were getting scared, that's when we started noticing a reduction in the customers that were coming in. We started to slowly reduce shifts right then and there, and then I'd say within about 72 hours, we not only lost our shifts, but were told that we were going to be closing the business. The business was nice enough to send us an email to say that they're definitely going to be rehiring us when this is over, but that is an indefinite amount of time that no one can quite speak to. So we've been devastated, and I say devastated not just for front of the house, back of the house, immigrants that were working without any kind of legal status. They have no rights to unemployment benefits, which were already skewed off by, as Saru said, a percentage of what we would have actually been making is what will be adjusted for unemployment benefits that many of us that were working part-time may not even be eligible for.
Do you get unemployment benefits, Damani?
I have applied for them, but I have not. A decision hasn't been made right now because the system continues to crash because everyone in New York City is unemployed right now. Not just, the crisis has made everyone stop working.
So can you talk about what you're most worried about right now with what people will turn to if they can't get financial support?
I think that people are going to turn to resourcing food banks, human resources, social services, but I feel like when that is full, I think that people are going to start needing to move in together to reduce their living costs. I think that people are going to think more about shared kitchens for feeding their families. I think that restaurants right now should be thinking about the food that is in the refrigerators right now should be donated to all food pantries because there's no one in the restaurants eating them, and there's not enough takeout orders that are going to work.
And if people get really desperate?
I think if people really get desperate, I think it's going to be very similar to the Depression. People are going to be out in the streets in lines waiting for soup and bread because there's no money to go around the city.
So, Sadhu Jayaraman, what kind of organizing are you doing? I mean, we're talking about people. I mean, you shelter in place, the whole San Francisco area, 7 million people. It looks like it's coming to New York as well. How do you organize in a crisis like this?
Well, as I mentioned, we launched this One Fair Wage emergency fund Monday morning. We've been raising money and doling out cash assistance to workers. But for every single worker that signs up, we're doing a one-on-one, a 1-hour conversation, talking to them about their needs, their situation. Why are we in this to begin with? And why we need to vote. We're signing people up to vote as we talk to them and to screen them to send out the checks. So it is a very strange and crazy and dystopian moment. The stories that are coming in of these 15,000 workers that have already applied are heartbreaking. I lost my job on Friday. I cannot feed my 3 children. I have children with developmental disabilities. I have children with illness. I don't know how I'm going to feed them or take care of them. I really don't know how I'm going to pay my rent to keep a roof over my head.
We're going to have to leave it there, Sadhu. I want to thank you so much for being with us, and be safe. Sadhu Jayaraman with the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, One Fair Wage. Also joining us from New York, Damani Varnado, longtime New York restaurant worker who was just laid off. That does it for our show. A huge thanks to our staff. Thank you so much to Julie Crosby, Miriam Barnard, Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Dennis Moynihan, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman.